who is a lieutenant in Special Operations Command, just married a Korean girl last weekend. And today is his birthday, so it's got to be a good day for Cambodia to have a rally. He's in Guam right now having his honeymoon. Anyway, you didn't come to hear about that.
I understand you very well. I'm such a big soul. I understand.
Oh, good. I'm glad. There's two words we should look at. Never again. Never again were the words that were spoken in 1945 at the end of World War II, when the Holocaust finally came to an end. The Holocaust Museum has these words. After the Holocaust, the world united behind two simple words, never again. These words represent a promise to past and future generations that we will do everything we can to ensure the horrors of the Holocaust are not repeated. Never again. And yet we know, 3 short decades after the guns fell silent in 1945, 3 short decades later in 1975, the specter of genocide rose from hell again and walked the earth. This time it did not walk over the gray skies of Europe. It walked over the sunny skies of Southeast Asia, the sunny skies of Cambodia. And this was a tremendous failure for the world. The world international community had promised at the end of the war, never again. Our First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, had gone to Paris in 1948 to sign the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which said, never again. And yet, as you all know, the Khmer Rouge came into Phnom Penh, and they began another genocide. The reports indicated, I was the Cambodia analyst in the 80s, when the reports were flooding in from Cambodia. Horrific reports. At that point, the Vietnamese had come into Cambodia, and some of the records were coming out of what had happened during the Khmer Rouge era. 2 million out of 8 million Cambodian people were killed, as you all know. I'm sure many of you had family members. And the world had said never again, but it did happen again. So, I wanted to read to you also, at that point, the world failed in its promise to Cambodia. You all might remember Prince Sirikh Matak from the House of Sisiwa. When the Americans were leaving Phnom Penh, the American ambassador, John Gunther Dean, offered to take Prince Sirikh Matak out of Cambodia. And he said, I must stay with my people. But he wrote a letter, a very famous letter that I want to quote today. He sent it to the American ambassador, and he stayed behind. Some people say he was shot in a stadium by a firing squad. Henry Kissinger said he might have been shot in the stomach and taken 3 days to die of bleeding. We're not exactly sure. But here is what Prince Sirikh Matak said. I thank you very sincerely for your letter and for your offer to transport me towards freedom. I cannot, alas, leave in such a cowardly fashion. As for you, and in particular for your great country, I never believed for a moment that you would have the sentiment of abandoning a people which has chosen liberty. You have refused us your protection, and we can do nothing about it. You leave us, and it is my wish that you and your country will find happiness under the sky. But mark it well that if I shall die here on the spot and in my country that I love, it is too bad because we are all born and must die one day. I have only committed the mistake of believing in you, the Americans. Please accept excellently, see my dear friend, my faithful and friendly sentiments, Prince Sirikh Matak. But the failure to Cambodia did not end there. I wrote a paper last month. You can see the national interest posted. I called it the failed promise to Cambodia. Because then the United Nations, I said, I think it was in Survivor's Guilt, they came to Cambodia. As I said, I worked on UN issues in the 1980s. We worked with the United States, worked actually with China and several countries to end the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia. And then the United Nations, because they remembered that they had not kept the promise, never again, they set up UNTAC, the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia, and they supervised elections in 1993. They spent $1.5 billion to have this election, to see that there were fair and free elections and that Cambodia became a democracy. But we all know what happened. We all know Hun Sen did not really recognize the results of the election. He said, I'm going to stay as co-prime minister with Prince Ranarid. And he stayed in power, and then he pushed finally Prince Ranarid aside a few years later. And so he has continued to rule for 28 years. And as I pointed out in my paper, a very disturbing thing, a shameful thing for the UN and the international community, is that Hun Sen is a former Khmer Rouge.
Yes! 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 Hun Sen must go! Hun Sen must go! Hun Sen must go! Hun Sen must go!
Hun Sen was a leader of the battalion in eastern Cambodia. He left the Khmer Rouge not because he was horrified by the genocide, not because he opposed human rights violations, but Pol Pot had decided to purge him. So he ran across the border into Vietnam and came back with the Vietnamese. But till this day, he bears a scar. He has a glass eye, because when the Khmer Rouge took Phnom Penh in 1975, and when they killed Prince Sirikh Matak, Hun Sen was there with the Khmer Rouge marching into your capital city, the capital city of Cambodia. This we cannot forget. This is a great cause of concern. It should be for the international community. I know that Sam Ramsey wrote a letter in August to Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and said, you must come back. You must look at the resolution that the United Nations passed, and you must help guarantee that these elections that were so flawed, the July 28th elections, that you must come in and assure that there are fair and free elections in Cambodia. I wanted to read to you briefly from the UN resolution that was passed back in 1992. This is the resolution that's, let me take a few of the quotes. This is what the United Nations promised the people of Cambodia in 1992. Reaffirming its full support for the agreements on a comprehensive political settlement to the Cambodia conflict signed in Paris on 23rd October 1991. Taking note of the report of the Secretary General on Cambodia, desiring to contribute to the restoration and maintenance of peace in Cambodia, to the promotion of national reconciliation, to the protection of human rights, and to the assurance of the right of self-determination of the Cambodian people through free and fair elections. United Nations, where are you today? You know where the United Nations is today in Southeast Asia? They're in Myanmar. Myanmar is the new popular country. But you have to finish the business in Cambodia, or your promises to the people of Myanmar to help them achieve democracy will never come true. Finish the work you began in Cambodia before you go to Myanmar, and make promises to the Burmese people that you cannot keep.
You unhair Cambodia!
Now I want.
Where are you?
When I worked at the House of Representatives as a staffer on Asian issues for 10 years, almost 12 years, the Korean American community came to me. They had a major human rights issue. They said, Mr. Halpin, what should we do? This was the comfort woman issue, an issue left over from the Second World War, the enslavement of Asian women by the Japanese Imperial Army. I said, you know what you have to do? You have to start having rallies on the Capitol. You have to get a resolution passed. And in 2007, H-Res 121 on the comfort women was passed by the U.S. House of Representatives. In 2007, the Korean American community stood up. And I say today, the Cambodian American community has stood up. And you must see that H-Res 310, Mr. Shabbat's resolution, is passed, and send a message to the Congress that this is a life or death issue for you in the Cambodian American community, and you want to see action taken by the House of Representatives. Now, my final remarks, I would like to say, some people say, well, Cambodia is not relevant anymore. The elections supervised by UNTAC were 20 years ago. Time has moved on. Well, in response, I would say Cambodia is relevant in many ways. First of all, Cambodia has a very young, vibrant population. Cambodia is located in the center of ASEAN, the center of Southeast Asia, where the economic miracle of the 21st century is taking place. If the Cambodian people were unfettered by authoritarian rule, if they were free to exercise their full economic and political rights, I say to you, the people and the civilization that built Angkor Wat can again become great achievers of economic development in the 21st century, just like their ASEAN neighbors. And, Cambodia came up a few weeks ago in the discussions in the United States because, as you know, there was a discussion going on of whether the president was going to take send bombers to Syria, have a bombing raid on Syria. Well, American historians looked back and they remembered the question, the debate, the constitutional debate, does the president have the authority to bomb a country upon which there's been no declaration of war, brought up the memory of Cambodia, because in 1971, President Nixon authorized or sent bombers to Cambodia without the authorization of Congress. Some people say that if it had not been for the bombing of eastern Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge would not have moved on the capital. That's a question of history. But people looked at that issue as far as the president today. Could President Nixon bomb Cambodia without congressional authorization? Could President Obama bomb Syria without congressional authorization? That is the same question. Cambodia is relevant. And another issue is with China. You know, the Khmer Rouge based their whole economic program on the Chinese Great Leap Forward and Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Just as the Chinese expelled students and intellectuals from the capital cities, so did the Khmer Rouge. As you know, in the Great Leap Forward famine, 30 million Chinese died. And today, China continues to support Cambodia. Even before the final results of the election were declared, Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, went to Phnom Penh last month and anointed Hun Sen again as prime minister. The Chinese foreign minister said, "You have won the election. It's over." They didn't care what the people of Cambodia were saying.